Afternoon and welcome to our CLGS event. My name is Ish Ruiz. It is an honor to have you with us. CLGS stands for Center for LGBTQ+ and Gender Studies in Religion. It is a center housed at the Pacific School of Religion, or PSR. Under CLGS, we have several teams that work on different intersections of LGBTQ+ identity and religion. This event is being sponsored by the Latinx Roundtable, which my name is Ish Ruiz, have the honor of chairing. Today we have an incredible speaker with us. His name is Jorge Aquino. He's going to offer a presentation titled Mestizaje Confronts American Fascism. Here's a little bio about our presenter. Dr. Jorge Aquino, PhD, is an associate professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Francisco, specializing in Latin American and U.S. Latinx Christian theologies and religious history, liberation, theologies, race, religion, sexuality, and the theo-politics of social movement. Dr. Aquino is involved in research, conference work, and publishing activities throughout the Americas. He earned his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union and came to USF in the year 2005. Again, the title for today's presentation is called Mestizaje Confronts American Fascism. And without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Jorge Aquino. Take it away.
Saludos, everyone. Greetings. I want to thank, first of all, the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, CLGS, and to Dr. Ruiz for your gracious invitation to speak. And I also want to wish you all a happy May Day, which seems particularly poignant this year. Dr. Ruiz, I understand, has loaded a PDF of some slides that I put together, just a few so that you have them handy in case you want to refer to them as we go. We're here to talk about Mestizaje in the time of Donald Trump's fascist media mafia regime. By way of overview, I'll start with an introduction on Mestizaje, considering how historical Latin American racial politics are colliding headlong into today's U.S. white supremacism. A key task is for us to understand how white supremacism begets fear and loathing of non-whites by way of a perverse psychological process. In the U.S., the privileged normative identities are white identities. People who are not pure in their whiteness, i.e. people of mixed origins, have always faced a struggle for social recognition. For non-whites, the remedy is assimilation to whiteness socially and culturally. Unfortunately, assimilation entails a double-edged psychological process. It's a process of hate. And publicly, it prompts white-identified people to distance themselves from non-whites. So this is kind of why our society is so segregated. And of course, as we all know, social distance can harden into hatred of racialized others. But the other side of the socialization of hate is how it begets internalized racism toward oneself and one's own genealogy. In other words, racialized self-loathing. So in the white racial crucible, becoming white means hating the racial other within. This is a vicious circle, right? White self-loathing seeks relief by diverting its internalized hate back out onto racialized others. So this is the kind of circle of racial formation on a psychological level that I want to focus on a bit in talking today about MAGA racial politics, sexual politics, and Trumpism. The social process of self-loathing and scapegoating is really epitomized in fascist regimes, such as the one we see gaining strength in the U.S. today. Trump is an example himself of how the process works. His racism shows signs of a sublimated self-hatred that he seeks to defeat by turning his inner hate out on convenient targets. And I say sublimated because I see these processes as mostly unconscious. But the targets of denigration and scapegoating in the Trump regime are not only people of color, but queer people, empowered, emancipated feminists, and people who belong to non-Christian religions. So I'll focus on Trump's war with Latinos and trans people and end with some reflections on the theo-politics of resistance. So just to begin, what is mestizaje? Mestizaje is a Hispano-indigenous word that means miscegenation. So if you're mestizo, you're mixed race. In Latin America, mestizaje first signified mixed race formations between Spaniards and indigenous people, and then widens to add African and Asian populations into the mix. Eventually, mestizaje becomes a signifier for every combination of racial mixing. Mestizaje gave rise to a substantial Spanish colonial project in which racial identification becomes the main tool for managing colonized labor. There's a warped theology of Spanish Catholicism that was key in this process. New World Spanish Catholics created racial classifications out of theological principles, especially principles of natural law. One of their key 16th century racial tropes classified indigenous people as slaves by nature. The crossing of race and religion was the toxic prototype of imperial Christian nationalism, the first of its kind in the modern world. Its gestures have often been repeated in the 20th century, of course, in German Nazism, in the Catholic fascism of Francisco Franco's nationalist Spain, in Latin America's military dictatorships throughout the 20th century, and today in Trump's white Christian nationalism. Now, Spain's racist colonialism struggled with a paradox. After the conquest of Mexico in the 1530s, there emerged a fairly rigid racial pecking order marked by 5 categories. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see if I can do this. Second. Okay. Hope you all can see that.
And thank you.
Okay, real good. So these 5 categories, these are sort of the originary colonial racial formations we get in basically the first 2/3 of the 16th century. First of all, you have peninsulares, Spanish people who are born in Spain, okay, the peninsula. On the second tier, you have criollos, or Creole people, Spanish-descended people who were born in the New World. Third, you had mestizos, mixed-race people. Fourth, you had indios, indigenous New World people, i.e. Indians. And then finally, Africanos, the Africans who were brought as slaves. Each category is associated with a different sorts of colonial labor. And there were different possibilities for prosperity and social mobility in each category. But the Spanish regime didn't bar mixed marriages. It needed more bodies for colonial labor. So as time went on, Spaniards were procreating with non-Spanish people at accelerating rates, especially indigenous and African people. So mestizaje becomes a major cultural phenomenon in the New World. Over centuries, it had a decisive effect on the formation of the region, the continent, and if you consider Latin American migrations, it had a decisive impact on our country, this country. The paradox was that mestizaje tended to destabilize the New World racial pecking order. So new classifications were invented to maintain the social hierarchy. The growth in these new racial types is illustrated in the image on this slide. This is a casta painting from 18th century colonial Mexico. We don't know who the artist was. It's in a museum in Tepoztlan. It depicts 16 couplings and 20 racial types. I want to focus your attention, rather than going through this whole chart, to really focus on the translation notes, which show some of the more spectacular types that were named in this multiplication of racial identities. And one thing I'd like you to notice is how racial denigration is embedded in many of the names as we descend down in each level. Okay, for example, numbers 4 through 6 make mention of moros or moras and moriscos. The moros being Moors, which can mean Muslim, it can mean Black in Iberia of the sort of the modern world. And then Morisco is a kind of a denigration name for Muslim Catholic converts. Mulatto, is a curious term. It means, best translation I can come up with is mulish. As you all know, mulatto in English is understood as a coupling between a horse and a donkey to produce this odd creature called a mule. So mulatto is a mixed race, a mulish mixed race, if you will. Chino in 6 and 7, it literally means Chinese, but we're not talking about Asians, I think, at this point. It's just a name they gave. 7 and 8 have this category called salta atrás, jump backwards. So it's kind of a retrograding, if you will, of the coupling, right? The salta atrás is a Chino and an Indian, an indigenous woman, producing this salta atrás, this jumping backwards. The lobo is a wolf. Tente en el aire, it can mean, floating in air, but I like throw your fate to the winds as kind of a hazardous, the result of a hazardous coupling, if you will. 15 and 16 has a category called no te entiendo, I don't understand you. And then finally, torna atrás, turning backwards, number 16, is the result of no te entiendo and an India, an indigenous woman, contrasting with salta atrás, in which the backward jump implies a continuing forward motion, whereas torna atrás is just a complete turning around, backwardness, if you will. Okay. Anyway, as you can see, race mixing was a challenge to Spanish colonialism, but the response was to double down on racial hierarchy anyway. So this is the reason why Latin people are so conscious of mestizaje. Now, despite its origins in colonial racism, mestizaje challenges today the monoracialism that's presumed as the ideal way races and cultures should exist in the world, at least as far as North American white supremacism is concerned. But this monoracialist supposition, it really doesn't reflect how cultures work in the world. Latin American mestizaje shows us why. There's no homogeneous, pure race, and we should dispute the idea that we can even talk about races. In fact, biological and cultural diversification are the anthropological norm for all of human history, while races are social construction and racial supremacism should be understood as a discourse of domination. In appeals to racial purity, we find the sort of fascism with which history has been filled, and our present era is one of those eras. So the monoracialist supposition is the cornerstone of Anglo-American white supremacism. And there we find two very misguided notions. First, that there's a mono race called the white race. And second, that the white race is superior to other races because of its supposedly unadulterated biogenetic stock. This was the obsession of Euro-American white supremacism throughout US history, and it's Donald Trump's working hypothesis about race today. Now, that obsession reached a fevered peak in eugenic science in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Eugenics is a far-flung pseudoscience that dreams of creating the perfect race through genetic breeding. It also begets policies to weed out less able or disabled people, especially those with mental disabilities or debilitating diseases. Eugenics was a major factor in the politics of immigration restriction in the 1920s, which led the U.S. to curtail most immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It also prompted sterilization campaigns, notably against Black people and Puerto Rican women. California had policies that led to the sterilization of 20,000 men and women from 1909 to 1980. By 1935, most states in this country had laws legalizing sterilization. Sadly, eugenics is still with us. Consider how Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy Jr., has been talking lately about autism. In an April 16th press briefing, Kennedy cited a study concluding that the costs of treating autism could reach $1 trillion annually by 2035. Then he said that autism destroys families, but more importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which is our children. These are kids who will never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job, they'll never play baseball, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. Kennedy's comments were quickly refuted by medical experts, as well as people who live with autism. But the worry remains that the Trump administration might resurrect eugenics in U.S. health policy. In 2 sentences, Kennedy replayed a eugenic discourse on public hygiene of the sort that animated immigration exclusion a century ago. Above all, it's alarm that people with physical or mental infirmities might become a public burden and thus should be amputated from society. We heard Trump take this eugenic turn throughout the 2024 campaign, when he repeatedly said that immigrants are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, unquote. Whenever Trump makes reference to our country, the our means white people. And Trump's idea of poison is racial adulteration, mestizaje, producing mixed people of darker shades who are somehow inferior or deficient or prone to crime, or who will burden taxpayer-funded services. So for Trump, it's white people versus mixed or non-white people. I think this is what accounts for his particular obsession with Latin American immigration. Of course, as with everything Trump, contradictions, lies, and ironies abound. U.S. white supremacism was born as Anglo-Saxon chauvinism. The category Anglo-Saxon, in fact, precedes whiteness as the dominant racial formation, first in the colonies and later in the United States. The category white emerges in wider circulation around the mid-19th century as immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe accelerates. Before that, Germans, Irish, Italians, and Scottish people were notoriously racialized as non-white or off-white, if you will. The country's first immigration statute, passed in 1790, authorized naturalization only for free white persons. So light-skinned non-Anglo-Saxons sought to assimilate by passing as white people. The nation's history is filled with court cases of immigrants from every corner of the globe seeking to litigate their whiteness in order to gain naturalization. What's interesting is that today few would question that the descendants of Irish or German people are white. Now, Donald Trump himself is not Anglo-Saxon. Trump's grandfather, Friedrich Drumpf, was German, coming to America in 1885. He was later denationalized as a German citizen for avoiding that country's military draft. It's interesting to consider that the loss of citizenship is part of the Trump family's experience. It's also interesting to note that, like his grandfather, Donald Trump avoided conscription, receiving 5 deferments from the Vietnam War draft, the 5th on a trumped-up medical condition. Lamentably, Trump did not lose his U.S. citizenship for being a draft dodger. On his mother's side, Trump's family was Scottish. The Scottish were denigrated along with the Irish as racial subalterns of the Anglo-Saxon English who founded the colonies. Trump's mother, Mary, was an immigrant, naturalized as a U.S. citizen only 4 years before Donald Trump was born. The Trump family seemed to harbor shame about his German-Scottish roots. In The Art of the Deal, Trump perpetuated the fiction that his father had come from Sweden, not Germany. Of course, immigrants from Northern and Western Europe were a higher status of white, according to the white supremacist logic of the 19th century United States. The irony is that Donald Trump, a white supremacist of mixed parentage, is something of a Euro-descended mestizo. Like the Latin American mestizos he sees poisoning the blood of our country, the whiteness of Germans and Scottish people was in question when his grandfather came to America. And perhaps this is what gets Trump's goat, driving his hatred of Latin immigrants. What he rejects in himself, racial mixture and second-class peerage, he denigrates in others of mixed-race ancestry. And so Latin people are perfect scapegoats for this sort of white racial loathing. So, I mean, Trump's personal shame and hatred aside, what does Mestizaje mean for the politics of Trumpism? Raoul Peck, in his extraordinary documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes, noted that America was born as a colonial power. And this fact is a difficult one to admit, for it bears the fatal capacity to disrupt the core story we've been told all these years and the very foundation of this country. It's not an easy story to tell because the story still continues today. A story of the search for purity and for a godly kingdom, a story of survival and violence, the search for origin, 400 years after the voyage that is said to have made the nation. Trump's movement is obsessed with this sort of white supremacist quest for a godly kingdom and pure origins. Now that's the dark heart of MAGA, the pith of its fascist imaginary. It resonates with Adolf Hitler's obsession with Aryan racial purity as the blood and soil root of the German folk. In the American story, the promises of democracy and liberty are contradicted by the brutal reality of white supremacism. But Trump's racially mixed second-tier European parentage also contradicts the white racial purity he champions today. So we might wonder if Trump's mestizo shame is what compels him to propagate his self-deceptions and lies about his identity and genealogy. It's not hard to imagine that Trump, to vouch his own purity, might be driven to destroy anything he can cite as impure. But it's not just racial impurity that obsesses Trump. He's also viciously hateful of those other American impurities: gender difference, women's power, queerness, and sexual diversity in general. I'd like to focus the last part of my talk on Trump's hatred of sexual impurity, which was a key tactic in his quest for authoritarian power. Since day one of his second term, Trump has unleashed a blitzkrieg assault on the whole edifice of U.S. liberal democratic government and culture, dismantling agencies across the board, supposedly for cost savings. But the larger strategy is twofold. First, destroy the social safety net for working people. And second, recoup as much government money as possible from those cuts to finance a multi-trillion-dollar tax cut for the oligarchical class. This destruction of liberal government would disable the working class's capacity to fight Trump's authoritarian project. And this is where his tariffs policy comes in. Tariffs function as a regressive tax on American consumers, driving up costs, especially for those at the bottom of the income ladder. Economists anticipate that this will lead to a recession. The anticipated destruction of small businesses and the resulting unemployment will deepen the divide between the 1% and the 99%. And this will also facilitate Trump's power grab. Third, he's attacking independent institutions of liberal political culture, so they cannot challenge him. This includes independent government agencies, the independent judiciary, the free press, public schools, colleges and universities, public libraries, and non-Christian religious movements. Finally, Trump is laying waste to fundamental constitutional rights enjoyed by all citizens. We see this in his attacks on DEI, his assault on social and medical support for trans people, his bid to scuttle birthright citizenship, and above all, his lawless immigration policy, which has unleashed a reign of terror among migrants and racially profilable Latinos. In sum, the fascist Trump regime is waging class warfare against the overwhelming majority of the country's citizens, working people. So you might ask, how is he able to keep his coalition together, particularly among working class people and people of color, as he openly wages war on their interests? The answer is that racist and heterosexist cultural warfare energizes that double-edged loathing of the other in his MAGA supporters. Trump has successfully unleashed their hatred, turning it out on the usual suspects: people of color, vulnerable migrants, queer people, and feminists. His attack on trans people is a cornerstone of his MAGA purification campaign. So I'm going to talk about just a few topics here, just a couple. There's a whole lot we could talk about here, but first off is the election campaign itself. In the run-up to November 24, the Trump campaign carpet bombed media markets all over the country with a devastating series of ads targeting Kamala Harris's support for trans rights. One Democratic super PAC believed the ads may have shifted the race 3 points in Trump's favor in key swing states. In one version of the ad, we have Black social media influencers Charlemagne the God and DJ Envy mocking Harris on trans rights. They say that Kamala even supports letting biological men compete against our girls in their sports. The ad's infamous tagline was, "Kamala's for they, them. Donald Trump is for you." There's also a visual tagline at the end of the ad, a happy white heterosexual couple holding a small child. These ads were a striking example of the Trump campaign's sophisticated intersectional fascism, pitting transphobic Black men against both trans people and a Black woman candidate in defense of those who are white and straight. The second topic is Trump's attack on trans people in the armed forces. On January 28th, he issued an executive order banning transgender people from the military service, claiming that radical gender ideology would undermine military readiness. In March, the order was enjoined by a federal judge in Washington, D.C. Case is on appeal, but during oral arguments, the judge's hearing the appeal expressed skepticism about the constitutionality of Trump's moves. A federal judge in New Jersey also blocked the Trump administration from using the order to fire 2 trans men from the Air Force. Third topic, trans people in college sports. On February 5th, Trump signed an EO titled "Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports," barring trans women from college athletics. Trump's order was issued one day after 3 former women swimmers from the University of Pennsylvania sued Penn, the Ivy League, Harvard, and the NCAA for allegedly violating their rights under Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. The cis women plaintiffs challenged the presence of Leah Thomas, a trans woman, in the 2022 Ivy League championships. Thomas was an accomplished athlete who had won an NCAA title in the 500-yard freestyle while at Penn. The complaint referred to Thomas as a, quote, trans-identifying male swimmer, unquote, and mimicked Trump's claims that allowing men to compete in women's sports was rooted in radical gender ideology. It also complained of swim meet arrangements allowing Thomas to use women's locker rooms. The suit seeks to expunge Thomas from the NCAA records, in effect erasing her accomplishments from college sports history. In March, Trump suspended $175 million in federal funding to the University of Pennsylvania over Thomas. Shortly thereafter, the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association rescinded its policy on trans athletes. Trump is also at war with Maine Governor Janet Mills over her state's anti-trans discrimination law and its policy allowing trans women to compete in women's sports. He claims both policies violate Title IX. During a February gathering of the nation's governors at the White House, Trump asked Mills if she would continue supporting trans rights. When she answered in the affirmative, he threatened to cut off federal funding to Maine, and she coolly replied, "We'll see you in court." The administration followed up by cutting off Department of Education and Agriculture Department funds to Maine. Those cutoffs are being litigated in federal court. Finally, topic 4 is gender identifications on passports for trans people. On January 20th, Trump signed an EO barring trans and non-binary gender designations on U.S. passports. The order allows only male and female, as those were assigned on the holder's birth certificate. The Trump policy was enjoined by a U.S. District Judge, Ana Reyes of Washington State. Trump's DOJ then retaliated against Reyes, complaining that she was not impartial, and has sought to remove her from the case. So a key question in all of this is, how do we resist Trump's massive assault on freedom and the rule of the law? How do we track his racist and transphobic attacks? As we said, he's bidding for authoritarianism on a divide and conquer strategy, taking a sledgehammer to democratic self-government and rights and the social welfare state to disable any institution that would contradict him. Dividing the body politic is key to his plans by way of culture wars. Now, his toxic hate politics are ginning up considerable opposition. Yet the strategy of targeting sexual minorities retains much of its power. I'd say, above all, because of transphobia, on top of the indifference of those who are not themselves being targeted by Trumpism. This is most true for Republicans, many of whom fervently confess their Christian faith. One of the strongest pillars of the MAGA coalition is evangelical Christians. And while many of them identify as biblical literalists, one has to wonder, what Bible are they reading? For example, what happened to the Hebrew Bible's multiple admonitions that we should welcome and shelter immigrants because the ancient Israelites were, quote, aliens in the land of Egypt? Leviticus chapter 19 likewise commands that when an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien with you shall be as to you as the native born. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Exodus 22 commands the faithful to defend and protect the poor, the widow, and the orphan. What happened to Jesus' many admonitions in the New Testament to defend the poor and marginalized, or his claim that one cannot worship both God and money? Jesus was crystal clear in his option for the poor and for downtrodden people. He insisted God would condemn those who failed to help the hungry, the foreigner, the naked, and the prisoner, as we read in Matthew chapter 25. It seems that in America, too many people, especially Christians, will not take a stand against an evil government unless that evil targets them directly. They are very much like the priest and the Levite in Jesus' Good Samaritan story in Luke chapter 10, who failed to come to the aid of a man they see wounded and bleeding after he has been assaulted and robbed on the road to Jericho. In light of this indifference, it's no wonder that Kamala Harris could not defeat Trump in 2024, despite her competence and compassion, and despite Trump's vicious racism, sexism, and transphobia. Even in Miami-Dade County, home to the nation's largest Cuban exile community, Trump emerged victorious despite his overt anti-Hispanic racism. Cubans there didn't seem to care that in his first term, Trump had deported record numbers of Cubans. My own view of my people, my Cuban people, is that too many of them think they are white. They seem to reason that, sure, Trump hates Latin American immigrants, but he's only going after criminals and undocumented people. He'll never come after us. Alas, not a month after Trump's inauguration, Miami's Cuban-American GOP Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar was writing desperate letters to the administration, begging it to spare the 500,000 Cubans, Venezuelans, and Haitian migrants that the Trump administration was targeting for deportation, many of them living in her district. This widespread indifference to Trump's destruction of rights is probably the most grave danger to freedom and democracy this country has ever seen. If you're on social media these days, you regularly hear recitations of Martin Niemöller's lyric about how the Nazis divided and conquered Germany. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." It's one of the most popular items folks are posting these days in spaces where point-and-click activism remains the last haven of righteous anger for the complacent. We have seen sizable anti-Trump protests, particularly among those who are directly affected by Trump's policies. But we have not yet seen enough mass protest from safe citizens in defense of vulnerable people, especially immigrants and trans people. It seems as though Niemöller's wisdom is easier to post about than to learn from. As it turns out, his refrain was the regretful confession of his own complacency amid the onslaught of the Third Reich. Niemöller and another famous Lutheran pastor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, quarreled over Hitler during the first year of the Nazi regime. Bonhoeffer had tried to warn of the dark chapter that was gathering for Germany. Niemöller, on the other hand, was more of a conservative. At first, he supported the Nazi Party, even celebrating Hitler's 1933 appointment as chancellor. But as 1933 wore on, Niemöller started to turn, coming out in opposition to Hitler's German Christian movement, an anti-Semitic Christian nationalist front for the Nazi Party. But by then, it was too late. Eventually, Niemöller was targeted by the Nazi regime and sent to a concentration camp in 1937. Unlike Bonhoeffer, who was hanged in 1945, just before the liberation of the Flossenburg camp, Niemöller survived internment at Dachau and died at the ripe old age of 92. If Trump is to be undone electorally, it'll probably come only through a weakening at the base of his own coalition. But I seriously doubt that will happen among MAGA Christians. If they can't already read their inerrant scripture and find no grounds in it for turning against Trump, it seems unlikely that they will ever abandon him. So that's my pessimistic reading, I would say at this point. I struggle with feelings that no doubt you are struggling with as well in this moment in America. And so I'd be very interested in hearing your perspectives on how to challenge his hate politics and otherwise entertain your questions about this presentation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I applaud you for the wonderful paper. And just let's begin with some discussion. I have obviously a few questions kind of writing down as I hear. Obviously, we only have a few minutes, but I would love to get your thoughts on something. The first thing is, I was very struck as a fellow Latino, right, by your analysis of Latinos who voted for Trump. I've actually had this book on my desk for a while, Defectors, and it's
Yes, Paula Ramos.
Paula Ramos, right? And it's the book about the tagline of the book, it's titled Defectors. The tagline is the rise of the Latino far right and what it means for America. And, I'm trying to understand as a fellow Latino, what does education look like for our own fellow siblings? I know that these are practical questions and that there's like a pessimism in your presentation. Like there truly is like I don't know where to go from here. And it's something that I too feel. So I want to like break it down a little bit more. It's like, how can we possibly reach some of these Latinos who I think in my honest opinion are simply voting against their own interest?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one I puzzled over. I think that I have to say that perhaps for a lot of us, Latino intellectuals, particularly scholars, I think we have to make much more of a commitment to a kind of public advocacy. And I will confess that I have been remiss in this myself because I've been watching this with Cubans. I used to live in Miami, so I'm very familiar with, the political culture there. And we definitely need to be more willing to show our face, I think, in op-ed pages, maybe in public fora, in town halls that we organize. It's possible. I mean, I mentioned the example of Maria Elvira Salazar, the congresswoman from Miami. She's a Republican. She's very pro-Trump. But if you read the letter she wrote to Homeland Security, she's really filled with anxiety that, for her constituents and undoubtedly for her own position as a congresswoman. Trump won Miami-Dade in the 2024 election. He was the first Republican, I think, since the 1980s to win Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade, believe it or not, trends Democratic until in the presidential races anyway. And they've had a number of GOP congressmen because obviously Little Havana and Hialeah and some of these more Cuban neighborhoods are going to be way more conservative. So I think it's conceivable that we could organize town hall discussions with folks like Salazar to present the question to Cubans in Miami. There's a campaign going on in Southern Florida now to sort of flag Trump's immigration policies. There was an ad run over, I think it was I-95 in Miami, featuring Rubio, Trump, and I think Salazar, and I forget now, but saying that these people are traitors, because of their support for Trump and how he's deporting Cubans in really big numbers. There's undoubtedly other things we can do, but I think becoming public intellectuals and speaking in a language that's more accessible to regular people, I think is critical.
Wonderful, thank you. The second question I had is actually kind of trying to steep myself in more into the queer epistemology of it all. So the idea that like LGBTQ plus people, I'm trying to move toward not just speaking about what's going on in America in terms solely of protection. That's certainly the first concern, is how do we protect, how do we include LGBTQ plus persons, especially the most vulnerable among them, which, as you named, are, I think, trans people, especially trans people of color. But also, how does queerness operate as a vantage point, that can also help us think through this? So in other words, does queerness as an epistemology present a potential window to how we can make sense of, the fascism that's taking place in our country today?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. I mean, I think, for me, my first response to that would be to think in terms of the kind of differential consciousness that is necessarily implied in a kind of a queer perspective. I mean, for me, queerness is really about destroying heteronormativity and living according to whatever particular sexual style or identity animates you at a particular moment, and that this is essentially a point of democratic freedom, right? One of the things that, I've done a lot of work in studying the history of Black liberation in the United States. That's been one of my second sort of mainstay of studies. And I'm really struck with the radical democracy that is implied in the perspective of Black liberation, And I don't mean just Martin Luther King and the mainstream civil rights movements. I mean also the ways that more radical movements, from Black Power down to Black Lives Matter today and beyond, increasingly we're focusing on a differential kind of politics that really presents us with what the meaning of democracy is all about. I mean, diversity is today vilified by the right as some kind of a disease, as some kind of a sickness, radical gender ideology, and all these things. The reality is that diversity is the essence of democracy. It is really about, I think in its ideal form, it is about a kind of inclusion in which all are respected, recognized, and not only as fellow citizens tolerated, but indeed as friends. I think, Martin Luther King had it right in the 60s when he diagnosed the American problem as a problem of democracy and a problem of racism. And his response was an approach to integration that would sort of level those differences in a way that everybody could be actually an equal participant in democracy. So, I mean, I would link the sort of, traditional democratic norms and ideals with a queer consciousness that says, this is going to lead to a diverse sexual culture, and that should be perfectly compatible with democracy and not something alien to it. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's
I agree with you. I agree with you. When I'm also like going a little bit back, and I'm like, we had a civil rights movement. We have marriage equality, quote unquote, in this country. So we have managed to shift enough laws in the past couple of centuries, but we left something behind. We left behind the changing of ideas. The civil rights movement did a great job at getting people, no matter whether you agreed to or not, to recognize the participation of all races in our American democracy. Where it failed at, and this is where I think our role as theologians is so important, is at the question of encounter, right? And how do we destabilize white supremacy? How do we destabilize heteronormativity? How do we destabilize patriarchy? Yes, there is a legal political venture that destabilizes that, but doesn't do it fully if people are still feel like they've been constrained to accept Black people and accept the queers and accept, so how do we destabilize that? And so I go back to this idea of encounter. Here's where Pope Francis, and this is timely because of his recent passing. So, right, where does this culture of encounter happen that can perhaps help change minds? And to me, queerness operates there. Queerness is a discursive and performative way of challenging normativity, whether it be hetero or white supremacy or patriarchy. It's, your presentation did a great job at outlining how mestizaje really has been constructed and articulated, but so has whiteness, right? And you even mentioned Donald Trump's parents and, or relatives, and they're German, and, so whiteness has also been constructed. So how can queer thought, so in my opinion, I should say, queer thought can perhaps help us start challenging where some of these categories come from in the first place, and whether it's sexuality or not.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. We're living in different times than we were, say, in the 1970s. I mean, I think of sort of the first real blow for queer folks is taking place, mid to late 1970s with, and particularly, I think particularly in the way Harvey Milk played politics in his day. He was an openly gay man, but he was also the kind of person who was very intersectional in his outlook on politics. He believed in a politics of friendship. And it seems to me, particularly when they were fighting over the statewide initiative, the Briggs Initiative back in, I believe it was 78, to essentially try to outlaw, queer teachers in public schools. Milk's strategy was to have everybody come out of the closet. And the more people come out, the more likely it is that straight people who are fearful would encounter, as you mentioned, people that they had never understood to be gay before or lesbian, and a possible approach of friendship could take place there. Now, that's not the times we're living in now. Trans politics is actually very much out, and queer politics in general, queer identities are out, and that's perhaps more threatening. One approach, and this is again pivoting a bit on how Harvey Milk thought about politics intersectionally. Economics was a key aspect of what he would push. He was pushing a working class politics that was also queer friendly. And I would say one of the things we need to really think carefully about is how to undo Trump's hegemony. Because really, if you think about what we're up against, it's about a really long-standing formation of a right-wing white supremacist hegemony that has been building on a backlash that began in the 1970s in the aftermath of civil rights legislation and so on. It was essentially, we could think of it as an axis between, corporate business interests and culture warriors. I mean, for me, there was sort of a three-legged stool that George W. Bush's hegemony resided upon. And, one leg was the Fortune 1000. The second leg was evangelical Christians and their various reactionary politics. And the third leg was a media landscape that was, both corporate and culture warring at the same time. One of the things that is a real vulnerability for this movement now is Trump's, you can call it incompetence, you can call it his overreach. It's probably the two of them together. He's doing a lot of things that are essentially attacking his own base. And I think he's counting on the continuation of his cultural warfare to shore that base up, when they're otherwise threatened. It's very, very clear that he and the Republicans who are behind him in Congress are essentially waging a very, very broad class warfare on the working class. And it's become so acute now after essentially, 50 years in formation. Turning it around is going to be difficult, but it's actually facilitated by the fact that Trump is kind of incompetent and he's always overreaching. He's already got in 100 days the lowest polling that we've seen of a president in like 80 years, from what I've heard. He's vulnerable. And a lot of Congress people like Maria Elvira Salazar in right-wing Miami is vulnerable. So that's one side of my proposal, is to go after those very vulnerable Republicans. The other side of it is, I think we have to primary Democrats. We have to destroy the establishment. Part of the problem and the reason Trump got elected was that the Democratic Party tacked toward a neoliberal politics in a very, very serious and heavy way, starting really before the Clinton era. But Bill Clinton was the signature politician who brought that home. And so I think that, for us who are more on the left side of the spectrum, we have to be uncompromising in our desire and our work to unhorse, folks like Chuck Schumer, to put out to pasture some of these establishment Dems. And I think one of the keys is, who are these people getting money from? Who are their campaign contributors? Who do they represent for real? If they claim they're working class, Chuck Schumer represents Wall Street. Joe Biden was a senator from the state of Delaware. He represented credit card companies and banks. Those were his real constituents. If you have student loans today, God save you, it's Joe Biden who has made it impossible for you to discharge those loans if you can't get a job after you graduate. They changed the bankruptcy laws in large part thanks to him, very proudly. So I think that, Mahatma Gandhi, in his strategy against British colonialism, understood that you will not convert all of your enemies, but you can take down an oppressive hegemony by attacking the more passive legs of that hegemony. And right now, I think, turning Latinos away from Trump, turning Black folks away from Trump, and then showing working people in general that this is class warfare, finding a way to talk about that.
This is not benefiting you in any way, and money is traceable, so you can't tell.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so. Yeah. I think those are approaches that, I think need to be more focused upon. But I'm a theologian. What do I know?
Well, plenty. I'll end on a lighter note. I recently watched this documentary with Will Ferrell. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see it. It's called Will and Harper. When Will
No.
Ferrell, the comedian, was and I'm going to share this person's name because it's on the documentary, and this person has no problem sharing it. But when Will was a comedian on Saturday Night Live, SNL, he entered with this person, and again, I'm using a dead name here, Andrew Steele, and who wrote all of Will Ferrell's skits. He was a writer, a comedic writer for SNL for years, and then eventually retired. But apparently, one of this writer's hobbies was to do these road trips down the South and would stop at these like dive bars full of like super conservative Republicans, and who just play pool with them. But
Brilliant.
as Andrew Steele, suddenly Andrew Steele is a transgender woman, right? Identifies as transgender. So after retirement, in elderly age, she transitions, and her name is Harper Steele. And she reaches out to Will Ferrell, and she says, I love this country. I used to love this country, but I don't know if it loves me back because now I am trans and I've abandoned my white man privilege, and now I am suddenly a transgender woman. And so Will Ferrell says, well, let's do something. Let's take a road trip from New York. I'll pick you up all the way to LA. And we'll stop at all your joints at all those places, and you can hang out with people. It's kind of neat to see these basically MAGA Republicans, because this is a recent thing, these MAGA Republicans interacting with this trans woman and telling her, you live your life. Like, we support you. You do whoever you be whoever you need to be. you know, but still are MAGA. And I'm here like, what an interesting dissonance, right? What an interesting dissonance that a person um, you know, can really vote against their interest and be completely unaware of how they're cutting their own legs off, and vote toward someone who is so hateful toward LGBTQ plus persons, but then face to face be like, oh well. And it happened several times throughout the pubs, right? What was interesting was that there was this one scene, and I hope I'm not spoiling too much, where there was a bigger crowd, and it was the bigger crowd that sheltered the conservatives to be hateful. And that's when there were some tweets, and then people hid behind the computer. And so this conversation about fascism is layered upon individual human beings' psyche and psychology. It is layered upon questions of technology, mass media, mass communication. Because if Trump can say that he thinks he is saying that he is building the best economy this country has seen, and the numbers are going down, but Trump is saying that they are not. So, and that's what matters almost. So there's all these layers playing here, and that's, I think, what's made it so hard for us as scholars, is that this is no longer a rational argument. This is no longer, gone are the years where you would have Mitt Romney and Obama. And I disagree with Mitt Romney, but I love that debate. Gone are those years where Mitt Romney and Obama could have an intellectual debate about how to best bring forward our country. And I disagree with Mitt Romney, but I understood what he was saying. Um, and now it's just this like para-rational, you know, uh, fixation with Donald Trump. And it's yes, I am at a loss as well.
What's the name of the documentary that you mentioned with Will Ferrell?
Will and Harper.
Will and
Will and
Harper.
Harper.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, with respect to your point about Trump, I mean, he himself has been lionized almost as an idol unto himself. And I think theologically speaking, there may be some kind of a project around idolatry that would address evangelicals. But again, I haven't thought that one through yet. Another subject for another day, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Jorge, thank you so much for the incredible conversation. Thank you for your wonderful paper, and thank you for engaging with me in this difficult topic. I share the concerns. I am with you, and I pray for this country. May all of us, especially us Latinos, really first of all wake up, and also second take active steps to encourage or move our country toward a more just society, which I think is very possible. With
Amen
that,
to that.
amen to that. With that, I thank you, and I will bid you adieu.
Thank you, Ish. Take care now. See you soon.